Her hands didn't shake. That was the thing nobody ever talked about afterward. Not the investigators, not the journalists, not the people who sat across from her in those stiff government chairs asking questions they already knew the answers to. They talked about what she found, what she reported, what it cost her. But nobody mentioned that when the call came in at 2:47 a.m., the one that changed everything, Nurse Brynn Calloway's hands were completely still. She'd been that way since Kandahar. The Peterborough Regional Medical Center overnight shift had its own particular silence. Not peaceful. Nothing about a hospital at 3 in the morning was peaceful, but compressed. Like the building itself was holding its breath between emergencies. Brynn knew every variation of that silence. She'd worked the ward for 6 years, long enough that the overnight nurses stopped introducing themselves to her and started just nodding, the way you nod at someone who's been standing on the same corner as long as you can remember. She liked the night shift. She'd always liked it, even before she understood why. The patient in 4B had been admitted 2 days earlier, a 63-year-old man named Gerald Okonkwo, recovering from a routine knee replacement, which in theory should have been the most uncomplicated file on the floor. Brynn had checked his chart 3 times that evening because something about his post-op inflammation numbers refused to sit right with her. Not dramatically wrong, just wrong in the particular quiet way that things go wrong before they go catastrophically wrong, the way a sound changes slightly in an engine before the whole thing seizes. She flagged it to the resident on call, a young man named Dr. Fitch, who had the particular brand of exhausted confidence that came from working 72-hour rotations and not yet having made a mistake large enough to teach him real humility. He looked at the numbers, looked at Brynn, and told her the patient was fine. She wrote it in her notes anyway. She always wrote everything in her notes. That habit, the documenting, the flagging, the quiet and relentless record-keeping, was what Dr. Sylvain Beaumont had called her persecution complex during the disciplinary review 8 months later. He'd said it with the particular smoothness of a man who'd spent decades learning how to say damaging things in the tone of a concerned mentor. The committee had nodded. Brynn had sat across from them and felt something go very still inside her chest, the same thing that went still in Kandahar when the radio crackled wrong and the air changed. She already knew what the decision was going to be before he finished the sentence. The formal termination letter cited persistent failure to demonstrate collaborative team values and a pattern of behavior inconsistent with patient-centered care. It was 6 paragraphs long and had clearly been written by someone in legal who had never once set foot on a hospital floor. Brynn read it twice, folded it in half, and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she went home, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table in Lakefield for a long time watching the sun come up over the Otonabee River. She did not cry. She had not cried since 2009, and even then it had been more about exhaustion than grief. What she felt instead was the particular cold clarity that had always arrived in her worst moments. The thing that had kept her functional through her 2 tours, through the field hospital in Spin Boldak, through the mass casualty event in June of her 2nd deployment where she and a medic named Torres had worked for 9 hours straight on bodies that arrived faster than they could be triaged. The clarity was not comfort. It was more like the moment before a fight when you stop calculating and start moving. She'd known, sitting at that table, that she was going to keep moving. The trouble was that she hadn't known yet exactly what she'd uncovered. Gerald Okonkwo had been quietly transferred to a private facility in Barrie 3 days after she was terminated. She found that out from a nursing aide named Petra who texted her because she thought Brynn would want to know. Brynn did want to know. She also wanted to know why his discharge paperwork had been backdated, why the infection markers she'd flagged had disappeared from the digital record, and why the billing codes on his file didn't match a knee replacement. They matched a procedure category used almost exclusively for patients enrolled in a specific bundled care pilot program that the hospital's research division had been running for 2 years. A pilot program funded, she learned, by a private health corporation called Veritas Health Solutions. She found that on a Tuesday. By Friday, she'd found 3 more patient files with the same pattern. The work she did over the next 4 months happened in the spare bedroom of her house, on a second-hand desk she'd bought from a neighbor, with a corkboard and a laptop, and the same focused silence she'd applied to every other impossible problem in her life. She was methodical about it the way she'd been methodical in the field, because in the field, sloppy thinking didn't just mean a wrong answer, it meant someone died. She pulled public records, accessed the hospital's patient advocacy portal, using login credentials she was still technically supposed to have, cross-referenced billing data with provincial health ministry reports, and called 4 former colleagues who trusted her enough to talk off the record. What she found was not complicated. It was actually the simplest kind of corruption, the kind that works, because nobody is looking at the right 2 things at the same time. Veritas Health Solutions was enrolling vulnerable post-surgical patients into a clinical trial without proper informed consent. The trial involved a post-operative pain management protocol that substituted a cheaper drug compound for the standard of care, a compound that Veritas held the patent on, that the hospital's administration had a financial stake in through a series of holding companies, and that had already been quietly flagged by 2 independent pharmacologists in a European study that never made it into English-language journals. The patients weren't being actively harmed in ways that were immediately visible. They were being given something that was probably fine, probably comparable, probably wouldn't hurt them, and being enrolled without their knowledge into a database that Veritas was building to fast-track regulatory approval. The risk was manageable, the profit margin was substantial, and the people running it had apparently decided that the math made sense. Gerald Okonkwo's inflammation response had been his body reacting to the substituted compound. It would likely have resolved on its own. Brynn had flagged it before anyone needed to make a decision about that, which was why she'd had to go. She sat with that for a long time. Then she called a journalist named Ctrl+Alt+Z at the Toronto Star who covered health policy and had written a series 2 years earlier on long-term care home conditions that had resulted in a provincial inquiry. Brynn had never met Tremblay, but she'd read everything the woman had written, and she knew, the way she knew about patients, the way she knew about terrain, that Tremblay was the kind of person who finished things. They met at a coffee shop in Peterborough in February. Outside, the snow was doing the thing it does in eastern Ontario in February, not falling so much as existing sideways. Tremblay was smaller than Brynn had expected and asked questions faster than most people talked. She looked at the folder Brynn had prepared and then looked at Brynn and said, "How long did this take you?" 4 months, Brynn said. "What did you do before nursing?" Brynn looked at her coffee cup. "Military." Tremblay nodded slowly, the way people nodded when something they'd sensed got confirmed. "What branch?" "Canadian Forces." "Medical technician." "2 tours, Afghanistan?" "Yes." There was a pause. Outside, a woman walked past with a dog who looked deeply offended by the weather. "Okay," Tremblay said. "I'm going to need 3 weeks." What happened over the next 3 weeks was the part Brynn didn't know about at the time, because she was not the one doing it, and because she'd learned long ago that the most important thing you could do in a situation requiring patience was to actually be patient. She went back to Lakefield, took a contract shift at a walk-in clinic in Peterborough, and began sleeping better than she had in 2 years. There was something about having handed the folder to someone else, someone competent, someone who would finish it, that had released something in her she hadn't realized she was clenching. She was 3 days into a Thursday evening shift when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She stepped into the back hallway, looked at the number for a moment, then answered. The voice on the other end was a woman. She introduced herself as Inspector Danielle Cote, RCMP Integrated Market Enforcement Team. She said she was aware of the materials Brynn had compiled and that she needed to speak with her in person. She said it the same way people said things when they had been saying them officially for a long time. Precise as measured, with the kind of deliberate calm that communicated that whatever was happening was serious without being designed to alarm. Brynn said when. Cote said, "Tonight, if you can manage it." She could manage it. They met at a hotel conference room in Peterborough, the kind of room used for real estate seminars and franchise information sessions, with stackable chairs and bad carpet and lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. There were 2 other people in the room besides Cote, a man named Agent Rourke from the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, and a woman who introduced herself simply as Thornton, who did not specify what organization she was from and whom nobody asked. Thornton had Brynn's folder on the table in front of her. "You compiled this yourself," Thornton said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Brynn said. "You cross-referenced billing data across 11 patient files, identified 3 shell companies, and traced the holding structure back to Veritas's parent corporation in 6 weeks." 4 months, Brynn said. Thornton looked at her. 4 months from your termination, 6 weeks from when you found the first patient file. Brynn considered that. She hadn't thought about it that way. "Yes," she said. "That's accurate. You have medical training and military training. I was a medic. Combat medical technician. CFB Petawawa, then 2 tours. Any formal intelligence or investigative training?" "No." Thornton tapped the folder once with 2 fingers, a small precise motion. "This is better than what our forensic accountants produced in 8 months, she said, and they had subpoena power. The room was quiet for a moment. Cote said Mrs. Calloway and then corrected herself. "Brynn, we've been investigating Veritas for 14 months. We have enough now with what you've given us to move forward. The charges will be significant. There will be a process, and you'll be part of it as a witness, and that's not going to be comfortable." She paused. "But that's not entirely why we asked you here tonight." Brynn looked at Cote, then at Thornton. She had the feeling she'd had in the field sometimes, the moment when the situation clarified, when the variables stopped being variables and arranged themselves into something you could actually read. She'd learned to trust that feeling. Okay, she said, tell me. What Thornton told her over the next 40 minutes was this. Veritas Health Solutions was not an isolated case. It was one piece of a larger pattern of medical data fraud and regulatory manipulation that had been operating across 3 provinces and 2 American states, moving through private health corporations and hospital research divisions, and in 2 documented instances, had involved the deliberate suppression of adverse event reporting in ways that had directly contributed to patient deaths. Not in Peterborough, not in Ontario yet, but in British Columbia and in Alberta, the files were already building. The RCMP had investigators, they had legal teams. What they needed, what they had been struggling to find, was someone who could work inside clinical environments without drawing attention, who understood both the medical documentation systems and the financial structures well enough to identify the pattern in real time, before the files were altered and the transfers happened. Someone who had already demonstrated, without any institutional support, that they could do exactly that. We're not asking you to go undercover in the traditional sense, Thornton said. We're asking you to consult embedded. You'd maintain a legitimate clinical position, we can facilitate that, and you'd be working with our team. Full protection, full access, and you would be reinstated formally with your record cleared before you begin. Brynn looked at the table for a moment. She thought about the night she'd flagged Gerald Okonkwo's inflammation markers and written it in her notes anyway, even though she'd known it wouldn't change what happened. She thought about the field hospital in Spinboldak and Torres, and the particular discipline of doing the right thing in the middle of conditions specifically designed to make the right thing impossible. She thought about her kitchen table and the coffee and the sun coming up over the river. What's the clearance level, she steadily. Higher than you've held before. I can work with that, Brynn said. There was a pause. Outside the hotel, someone was scraping ice off a windshield. The sound was very ordinary and very far away. One condition, Brynn said. Cote nodded. The patients in the existing files, Okonkwo and the others, I want to know they're being followed up medically, not just as witnesses. Cote and Thornton exchanged a look. Then Cote said, already arranged. Brynn nodded. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair the way she'd picked up her kit bag every time before a deployment, with the same quiet, forward-facing attention. Not excitement exactly, not relief. Something more precise than either of those. The Veritas charges were filed 6 weeks later. Dr. Beaumont and 2 members of the hospital board were named in the indictment. Serge Tremblay's piece ran the following morning and was picked up nationally by end of day. The hospital issued a statement expressing shock and committing to a full internal review. The statement used the phrase patient-centered care twice. Brynn read it on her phone while she was waiting for a briefing in an office building in Ottawa that did not have its name on the directory. She put her phone back in her pocket and went inside. Her hands were completely still.